Welcome to another edition of ACRP TV, our spotlight on innovative COVID-19 clinical trials today. It's been so heartening, if that's the right way to use the word, in the midst of this COVID crisis to see how the clinical trial industry has really banded together in some unique and innovative ways. It's really brought out the best, I think, in a lot of us, and it's been very inspiring. We have one such inspiring story with us today. We're going to be talking to Mike Dean in a second, but I want to first thank two people who helped pull this one together. Jerry Burr, who's the executive director of the Utah Trial Innovation Center, and Jerry Stein with Sumner Creek Consulting, both of whom helped me a lot to pull this together. But I especially want to thank our special guest here, Dr. Mike Dean, who's the Associate Dean for Clinical Research and the Director of the Clinical Trials Office at the University of Utah's School of Medicine. Mike, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today on ACRP TV.
Thanks for having me.
And we were talking before we came on air there for a second. I love your backdrop there. You said that's China from 20 years back, huh?
Yeah, it's a photograph from 20 years ago.
Pre-COVID. All right, let's just jump in. Talk about you did this very innovative study that you were very involved in. If you could first just give us a little bit of a background and timetable of how this study was pulled together so incredibly quickly.
Sure. The mention of hydrochloroquine, which is an anti-malarial drug, at a presidential news conference led to a fair amount of interest in the state of Utah for getting access to this drug for the population at a political level. And there was a fair amount of work at the state level to try to make this drug available to patients outside of the normal clinical methods of care. This led to serious negotiations between the two largest healthcare partners or systems in the state of Utah. That is the University of Utah's health system, UHealth, and Intermountain Healthcare, to come up with clinical trials that would enable hydrochloroquine and other drugs to potentially be available to citizens of Utah, but within the context of rigorous clinical trials, as should be done with any unproven therapy, particularly when everyone is trying to do something about a disease that they don't understand. So we started initially with an inpatient trial that was brought to the University of Utah by Intermountain for statistical consultation in the week of March 20th. And several days later, the decision to have an outpatient trial combining the efforts of Intermountain Healthcare and the University of Utah was raised. So the trial was originally going to be hydrochloroquine versus a comparator arm, but there was disagreement about the comparator arm. So the trial started out with the plan for there to be one trial using both institutions. But after collegial discussion, we decided to split this trial into two different trials, one primarily executed at the University of Utah and one primarily executed at Intermountain Healthcare. The primary differences are the outcomes are different between the two trials, as I'll explain in a minute, and the comparator arm is different between the two trials. At Intermountain Healthcare, the comparator arm is azithromycin. So this is a trial comparing hydrochloroquine versus azithromycin for outpatients in Utah. And the outcome of this study is hospitalization. So hospitalization within 14 days of testing positive with a polymerase chain reaction PCR viral shedding assay. The university trial is hydrochloroquine versus placebo, and for outpatients also, and the outcome is negative viral shedding. So the two studies between them will enroll approximately 2,000 patients. The university trial will enroll 400, and the Intermountain Healthcare trial will enroll approximately 1,600.
Talk a little more about your role in the trials.
So I'm the clinical data coordinating center director. I've been directing data coordinating centers for NIH-funded networks for about 20 years, and I'm the principal investigator of the Utah Trial Innovation Center, for which Jerry Burr is the executive director. I was involved from the very beginning of planning the protocols because I know the investigators both at the university and at Intermountain Healthcare quite well from previous interactions. And when we put the protocol together and had discussions, the decision to separate these two trials quickly rather than spend 2 to 4 weeks arguing about the comparator arm or disagreeing about the comparator arm was partly due to my consultation with the NIH and with other trial innovation centers at Duke University and Johns Hopkins University. So I direct the team that's handling all of the data coordinating and much of the clinical coordinating functions. So we're acting as sort of a combination, almost academic CRO. I'm also involved with the University of Utah Clinical Center for Translational Sciences, which is a CTSA award from the NIH Institute called NCATS that funds 62 CTSAs around the country, and I'm involved with that network for the last several years.
Now, you mentioned the word collegiality a few times, and I don't mean to sound Pollyanna-ish, but I'd like to know if you have been seeing a new spirit among maybe some of your colleagues. Not that we didn't work together before in some ways, but it does seem like things like the rising tides lift all boats, and it seems like sort of emotionally this industry is really rallying together. I mean, has that been your experience? Because you were able to put this trial together in probably near record time.
Yeah, I think absolutely that is the case. I will say that the University of Utah and Intermountain Healthcare have been close collaborators for nearly 3 decades. And we're obviously located in the same city, in the same state. So there's a collegiality there, even though we're 2 different clinical systems and there's fierce competition for clinical services between the 2 institutions. But the fact that Intermountain came to us early on with the original inpatient study for statistical consultation reflects the ongoing relationship between the institutions. And many of their attending physicians are faculty at the University of Utah. But more importantly, I think we've seen cooperation and collaboration at every level. For example, the FDA provided a letter of exemption for these 2 trials in less than 90 minutes.
Wow, 90 minutes?
Yeah, 90 minutes. And I think the immediate deployment of senior staff was a commitment from the leadership of the university as well as the leadership of Intermountain. But within 2 days of beginning the plans for these 2 trials, we had a Sunday afternoon conference with investigators from Vanderbilt University, Duke University, Tufts, and Hopkins, as well as program staff and scientists from the National Center for Accelerating Translational Sciences, which is NCATS. We had a 2-hour Sunday afternoon phone call during which we went through what each of the partners could do to assist with bringing these trials up quickly. As an example of that, the DSMB functions are being entirely handled by Johns Hopkins University. That took that off my plate to have to organize. And this was a unique problem because every expert about COVID in the state of Utah who could have been on a DSMB was involved with the trials. So we needed people that were outside of the state. And Hopkins had a DSMB assembled by Monday morning. So we had a DSMB assembled within 12 hours of requesting somebody to try to put it together. The DSMB charter was approved in 12 more hours. The DSMB reviewed the protocol 2 days later, and we were cleared to move forward on the first trial, which was Intermountain, opened enrollment at 6 days after the initial discussions began. The university trial opened at 13 days after the start of the process. I will say the university trial is unique in that we are asking subjects in the trial to self-sample their oropharynx because we don't want to send research personnel into their homes on a daily basis to get the viral titer tests. Simply because of the risk of sending research personnel into the home on a regular basis. So a very unique aspect of the university trial is that subjects are actually sampling themselves and we have a courier service that picks up and delivers the supplies for this, and we're going to and are obtaining samples on days 1 through 14. We're also attempting to get samples on household contacts who are volunteering to do the same thing. That is, they're not on drug, but they're taking swabs and sampling themselves so we can look at household transmission.
Now, you and I are speaking on May 7th, and we're obviously still at the height, if we even know what's going to, we don't know what the future is going to be with this pandemic, but it's still obviously very much a vibrant thing to be dealing with. But I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit. You've touched on this some already, but give us maybe a snapshot, sort of a status of where the trials are right now.
Well, both trials are actively enrolling. The Intermountain study started enrolling a week earlier, and the Intermountain study does not have sampling of swabs. So the Intermountain study has enrolled about 80 patients, and the University of Utah study has enrolled about 25 patients. One of the logistic issues for us with the university study was the need for supplies to do the viral testing and the need to obtain those supplies without taking them out of the clinical pipeline of supplies. So we had to identify an alternative type of swab. We had to identify an alternative supply line, and we were able to purchase 14,000 swabs from a pipeline or supply line, I should say, that did not compete with the clinical services. So I think the enrollment now is between 5 and 10 patients per day between the two. We are not certain of when the surge is going to maximize in Utah. We have had a very flattened curve as a result of having shut down the state almost immediately. We've been under lockdown since approximately March 15th. So we're anticipating that we will have an increased number of COVID cases all the way into July. And we're also anticipating that this may subside and we may have to complete enrollment in these studies in the fall or winter next year, when I think most people anticipate that we will see another wave of the COVID pandemic.
So you've just anticipated my next question a bit. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about future milestones you're looking for as the trial progresses.
Well, these two trials are looking at a drug that's of intense interest. Obviously, I think the risk is trying to peek at the data too quickly. So we do have prospective plans for when we're going to do interim analysis. And I think one of the things that I will, as the director of the Data Coordinating Center and the statistical team, be making sure that we all adhere to is not getting tempted to have the DSMB do a efficacy look before the planned time to do that. So I think the milestones is a hard concept when you bring a trial up in 5 days. Our main milestone was to start enrollment so that we could tell the leaders of the state that the citizens of Utah now had access to drugs via a controlled clinical trial setting in which there would be safety in taking these drugs. We had hoped that we would be able to enroll for both of these studies within 3 to 4 months. I think the fact that enrollment has been a little bit slow because the number of cases has been relatively small is good, and so it's good for the health of our population. It's not ideal for doing a trial, and of course everybody that's on this, that's listening to this this interview, is aware that every time you start a trial, it seems like patients disappear from being eligible for the trial.
Before I let you go, and I really appreciate your time here, are there any lessons you all as a group have learned in the run-up to in the startup for this trial that you think you might be able to take into other trials in a hopefully post-COVID world?
There are a number of lessons. I'm not sure that these lessons will be learned by our industry after we get out of the current emergency, but one lesson is that, as everybody knows, our protocols are too complicated, and bringing these two COVID studies up forced us to be quite pragmatic in the decisions about what the endpoints would be and the quantity of data that are being collected. since we don't have physical access to these patients on a frequent basis, we are collecting relatively sparse data about physical examinations and about vital signs and laboratory sampling and so forth, and emphasizing patient-reported outcomes. In one trial, we have many patients that are reporting the results by text. In the other trial, we're recording the results by accessing their electronic health record and having them communicate through the electronic health record. But everyone in this industry has been talking about our trial protocols being too complicated, and this has forced us to come up with some relatively pragmatic trials with less data collection. I think also the decisions about endpoints and things like that, we decided, I think in a unique way, to split into two trials that were perhaps more bite-sized, 400 patients, 200 and 200 in a placebo-controlled trial was probably wise. It's a phase 2 trial, and the other is a sort of a phase 2 comparative efficacy trial between hydrochloroquine and azithromycin. And these were pragmatic decisions that were made fairly rapidly. I think the one lesson is going to be about site monitoring and how we do site monitoring. We're going to be doing our site monitoring is being done by my staff. I have a clinical trials office that has site monitors in it, but we're not sending site monitors to peruse every paragraph of the chart of all of these patients. We're clearly not going to be able to do 100% source verification. There's really no source verification is a difficult concept when you have patient-reported outcomes. If the patient reports the outcome into a computer system, there is no source data to verify. And patients sometimes report information that's inconsistent from day to day. So I think we have to adjust what we think about as adequate or inadequate, SDV. I think that's a big one to me. I also think that we're doing electronic consent for obvious reasons. We didn't want any paper going around. We didn't really have the opportunity to do direct face-to-face consent. So while this technology has been available for many years, this is the first time that we had to jump into it on the deep end of the pool, if you like. So these two trials are doing all of the consenting electronically and remotely, which I think is going to transform how we do our future studies. It has forced us to engage this technology, and the technology works quite well.
Fantastic. We've been speaking with Dr. Mike Dean. He's the Associate Dean for Clinical Research and the Director of the Clinical Trials Office at the University of Utah School of Medicine. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time and obviously appreciate the work you and your team are doing right now.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all very much for joining us for this episode of ACRP TV Spotlight on COVID-19 trials, rapid startup, and innovation. We'll see you next time.